And so just to kick things off, I'm going to ask one of the easiest questions. Who is Onyinyechi Daniel?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you. I'm very privileged to be able to join you all today. So thanks, uh, Stephen, for the invitation, and Nick, Professor Soulakis, for agreeing to moderate the discussion. I think it's fantastic, a fantastic collaboration across industries. So I'm definitely happy to be here. Um, so who am I? I am a very passionate, uh, very intuitive individual. I have several things that I'm passionate about. There are several hills that I'm willing to die on in this life, and healthcare, data, AI, and technology, and addressing health inequities are just a few of those hills. I think, one philosophical principle is that, life is interesting when you have some hills to die on. And so I see a lot of value in, um, holding on to some of those passions and really leaning into them as part of my service while I'm here, the short time that I'm here. And so that really has informed my entire um, career path, both academic and professional. And I think um, it's the convergence of the things that I'm passionate about, that just makes the work very special and make it fun. And along the path, just learning so much, just a love of learning, always curious and always asking questions, asking why. Why is it this way? Why is it, I think that has really informed and shaped um, my path, both personal and professional. And so that pretty much sums it up. Oh, and I do like football, but real football, soccer here. I'm a huge fan. So
And you've got quite a team here in Chicago, so this is a good convergence for you. And I see a through line in the roles and responsibilities that you've taken on professionally. Um, did you grow up as a little girl thinking, I'd love to work at a health plan? What motivated this pathway? Clearly, your heart is in the right place. But I think I noticed we have some students on the call. I think they would love to know, like, what motivated you to take these roles and responsibilities. It's not easy.
yeah. Well, growing up, I guess in elementary school, primary school, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. At least I said I did. Now I don't know how much of that was the typical, at least prior generation Nigerian mandate of doctor, engineer, lawyer, and maybe accountant. That was kind of influencing me back then. So I wanted to be a doctor. But when I got into undergrad, um, I realized that I didn't really want to be at the bedside. I didn't want to be kind of point to point patient care. I loved healthcare, but I didn't want to be at the bedside. And for some reason in undergrad, I also had the keen understanding that I would have to work on the weekends. And that just didn't really fit right with me. It's just like, what? Like being on call, working on the weekends, like it was just a combination of those things that was just kind of not appealing. But I had the good fortune of discovering public health. And for me, it was like it really clicked. So I majored in biology and chemistry in undergrad, still love the sciences, but also heavily into philosophy and into history and into other areas. But discovering public health was probably the biggest, um, like, it was a huge step in enabling me to still pursue healthcare in the way that I wanted to pursue it, which was more broad scale, broader impact, and just more a more open path for going in different directions within the healthcare space. And so um, that was a huge thing for me along the path to pursuing public health. I had always been into philosophy, even in undergrad, and you know, made a stop at Northwestern. They had a medical humanities bioethics program. It was just perfect. It's like, wow, I get to go on ethics rounds and really grapple with foundational ethical principles associated with individuals, consent, autonomy, the different philosophical bents, what does it mean to be a person, a fully actualized person, and what are the implications for how we place ourselves in the universe? And so that was fantastic. And then I think along the way, kind of getting more into public health, um, I was able to kind of get into more of the technological, more on like the statistics and just like programming languages and things like that. But that really, I was like, this is great. Like, it was just great. And kind of in a, I like to call it a divine convergence of interests. Um, the School of Public Health that I attended had a public health informatics program, which kind of gives you that combination of the technological and technical application of public health principles to kind of solve more of these broader healthcare issues. And in parallel to that time, I was still working full time. I was in school full time. I was pregnant a couple times during that period. So it was definitely a challenge. But again, I think that's where the, you know, life and that passion, as long as it's there, you just kind of tackle them with enthusiasm and exhaustion. Because, just believing in these, um, believing in this, in what I'm pursuing and in the value for the greater good is kind of the energy needed to to make it through all those challenges. So that's really kind of the path, from undergrad to where I am today, which I think is just it's been fraught with a lot of challenges, but it's also been very rewarding.
That's excellent. I really appreciate you sharing that. I love origin stories personally, and so that's great to hear. And the students think we all are just hatched as professionals. So it's great to hear that we're human beings that things get hard, things passion just pulling us through that exhaustion. As a PhD student, I also said I'm we're not going to get married till I graduate. Well, maybe we'll get married. We're not going to get a place. We got a place. We're not going to have a kid. So we all know these checks and balances that get us through our graduate career. And you're never going to get an argument from me about public health informatics, and I think that, one of the great collaborations between the Quinlan School and Parkinson is that we do look at systems level change and innovation. And I think public health, of course, clinical informatics, all the informatics look at systems level change. But me personally, I really recognize what you do, outside of the hospital in the bounds of public health, which and even going into the community, your work spills over into our everyday lives in the community. So that systems level change is something that we strive for at Parkinson. You said it. You said, no, I'm not going to work on the weekends. I don't want to be on call. But I bet there's some folks on this call that probably have a pager right now because their system is crying and needs their help and it wants to tell them about it. I had that pager myself. So it kind of leads me to, so then what is your day-to-day like? What is it that you do? And were you able to escape those weekends?
No. I was not able to escape the weekends, but at least I got to kind of do it on my terms. Nobody had to call me in. Um, and I mean, a lot of what's happening in the space just requires a lot of deep thinking. And sometimes kind of being in the industry, I always have one foot in academia, but being in the industry, the pace of change and the need to rapidly adopt and, really adapt to change is just so fast. And it can be hard to get some time to actually think and strategize about best approaches. One example that I'll give is around, um, like AI governance. I think last year everyone was just super aware of AI, even though it's been, it's kind of old hat at this point. But I kind of liken it to health insurance companies kind of, falling in love with social determinants of health and health equity, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, when having to explain, well, that's like old hat public health, like it's just not very well funded, right? But like it became this thing. And so needing to understand the industry, where we are, and think strategically about how do you translate the theoretical um, principles around ethics and governance in a way that meets up with the pace of change in a business context, and that takes into account the strengths from the academic community that we often don't have time to dig into so that we can implement these things successfully. And it just requires it, it required a lot of, I'm the type of person that I'm always taking some class. I will never be in a formal academic program again. Well, I think I can safely say that, but I don't know. I've taken so many classes since I graduated that I probably have enough credits for another program, but constantly asking the question. So taking courses to understand more deeply, generative AI as opposed to traditional AI, and large language models and imaging, generative imaging and voice, and, different generative capabilities, and what the implications are not just from a potential to innovate in the field, but from a safety and ethics perspective, and constantly thinking about who is going to be impacted, and the fact that there's an individual at the end of every data point, right? And sometimes we can lose sight of that in our endless pursuit of more and more data, right? And so kind of assessing, at least in my current role at Highmark Health, assessing our existing business processes, and there are many, and saying, how do we embed um, AI ethics and governance end to end in those business processes? But how do we also not run afoul of all of the pieces of legislation? And how do we take into account all of the, white papers, different senators writing white papers? What are they thinking? Different bodies writing principles and guidance, whether it's the NAIC AI Model Bulletin, the EU AI Act, the US Executive Order on AI from last October, and then keeping track of all the pending pieces of legislation that are sitting in various places in various states. I think last year there were 65 um, activities, or maybe, I don't know if you call them actions or activities, related to AI just in 2023 alone. So how do you keep track of those so that we understand, how do we make sure that we're strategically thinking about this in terms of what the potential um, regulators are going to be looking for and asking us? Um, and not just point in time today. Like, we're not just trying to implement today and be done with it. How do we make sure that as we're building and implementing, we're taking those things into account without stymieing innovation? Because oftentimes governance is looked at as, the enemy of innovation, you know. And so all of that, again, it requires a level of commitment to continuous learning and asking questions, and just recognizing that you don't know, you don't know all the answers. Every day I'm very comfortable saying, I don't know. I don't know how to think through risk and whether we move forward with something related to AI that's high risk, or whether we should not. Like, I don't have the perfect answers, but it's a continuous learning journey, and then just sharing what we do know, so that the entire industry, at least from a healthcare perspective, can be elevated and continue to mature. So
That's great. I wanted to ask a question just going off of that. And by the way, if folks have questions in the audience, just raise your hand, and I am here to moderate, so I can do my job if necessary, beyond just talking. I did want to ask the question, because constantly asking questions, we've got to constantly ask questions, and I do believe that is the right approach. So who asks the best question? Well, one is, do you get to ask your own questions? And then if they're not your own questions, who asks the best questions? And lastly, does everyone get to ask a question, or is governance representative enough that you feel like we can handle our own governance here at Highmark? We have the perspectives we need.
Yeah, I would say that's a really good question. I would say the people that tend to ask the best questions are the ones that are going to be impacted by whatever is being implemented. And sadly, oftentimes those questions or those individuals aren't at the table to ask those questions, right? And you end up building something that is impacting those individuals without having had their voice at the table. And so what I like to do kind of from that approach is make sure that the voices of those that are impacted are at the table end to end, at the front end, the tail end, and that there's some kind of mechanism for a continuous like feedback loop to continue to improve. I think it kind of goes even further than, AI or data. When we look at like health equity as an example, a large payer like Highmark, it's kind of hard to develop a robust health equity strategy without having like the actual individuals impacted at the table helping to build that strategy. Strategy is not just to be built and then dispersed or distributed. It's supposed to be collaboratively developed and then owned by all, right? And so there's just a dynamic that I think exists, and I've talked about it a couple of times of the size of the organization shouldn't dictate the amplification of the voice, right? So there's a level of humility that I think larger organizations have to have when it comes to healthcare and the things that we're doing to hopefully improve healthcare outcomes for as many people as we can, where we kind of take a back seat and not position ourselves as the authorities on all things, but really a listening partner and being intentional about um, incorporating what we're hearing from those that are impacted as part of building out the strategy. And that approach, I think, again, cuts across whether it's something related to data and AI implementation, data and AI governance, health equity, addressing health inequities, um, you know, enterprise strategy, like that principle of humility, I think goes a longer way because you get that buy-in, you get ownership across the board. And so one party doesn't feel like they're kind of there just to, you know, like to kind of decorate the room. They actually feel like, value contributors in the strategy that's being built because they're the individuals that are going to be most impacted. So,
That's great. I really appreciate that perspective, and of course, bringing the community partners under the tent is always going to enrich the decision making process. And I do wonder though, in my own work, as an informatics professional, informatics scientist, there's almost always data that goes along with our projects, and when you're seeking to bring in those additional voices. Are there ever questions about the the about governance, in so much as access to the data might be something that the community is interested in? Some communities are moving towards an autonomous model where they will cooperate in data collection activities, but ultimately they would like to own the data themselves as an asset for that community. Are you at a place where the community is informed enough that they ask for access to the data, or a different data governance model than maybe what you have in place?
yeah, I think there's two things. One is the very uh, a large issue. The other is actually they're both pretty large considerations. So one, in terms of the community, I've seen an increase in, kind of community-based organizations wanting to have more ownership of the data, and just being more intentional about collecting it, storing it, managing it in a way that could help them um, develop better insights or more insights to drive, their strategy, right? So we've seen that increased level of interest. Um, and I think it's fantastic. The big uh, issue I think that remains is around interoperability of data. So, I mean, 2019, Donald Trump finally says, hey, we're going to mandate this interoperability across healthcare systems, health insurance companies, provider systems. It was a long time coming, very much needed, because prior to that, electronic health record companies, there was a lot of reward in keeping your proprietary systems, proprietary data, everything separate. But ultimately, that's not necessarily best for the patient or a member, right? We're just now getting to a point where we're just now kind of crossing the hill on interoperability. And it was a huge Herculean effort to get to where we are today. Now we're starting to finally see EHRs talking to each other, obviously incentivized through risks of enforcement penalties, et cetera, from CMS. So it was a long time, though, to get to where we are. And we still have a ways to go in terms of interoperability between hospitals, health systems, health insurance companies, and community-based organizations, as an example, that may be doing more of those community-based coordination activities around things like the social determinants of health, transportation, housing, food insecurity, access issues, things like that. So there needs to be a concerted effort that prioritizes interoperability between those entities. And I haven't really seen it yet. I think, maybe and I could totally have missed it. Um, but that's what I'm seeing. It's like as that interest is growing in community-based organizations, they're going to want to have ways of, exchanging data that go beyond the health information exchanges that we have today, right? So that's one. The next issue, I think, is what we could probably consider a data inclusion issue. So a lot of organizations are building machine learning models, constructing algorithms with different feature sets based on existing data. And those are supposed to target certain outcomes that hopefully um, you know, will be directed towards addressing the quintuple aim, right? So better health outcomes, lower cost, better physician experience, better patient experience, and health equity. Um, but for a lot of those models that are being built today, the upstream data collection was not taken into consideration at the point of data collection. You're just kind of using the data that you have and saying, wow, this is great. We built this model. Hopefully you're, testing the model for bias, adverse bias, testing it for fit, testing it for model drift, etc. But it's not as though we can honestly say, and maybe some organizations can, but we can't like broad scale say that there was a lot of thoughtfulness put in at the point of data collection, which is really where we're going to be able to tackle some of those downstream issues associated with models such as bias, lack of explainability, etc. And so if models are being built targeting a certain population and that population isn't representative in the data, then we just have to ask ourselves, like, what are we saying here? So I always say it's hard to get excited about downstream machine learning models and the algorithms that we build and the outcomes if we're not excited about the upstream, number one, data collection and data management in terms of how that data is governed, the quality of that data, et cetera. Right now, I think we're balanced on the tail end. We're balanced on, we're skewed towards the algorithms downstream because that's where most of the excitement is and because it is supposed to lead to certain actions that could improve certain outcomes. But I do think we have to rebalance back upstream. We need to go all the way upstream to the point of data collection, so that the groups that are going to be impacted are actually represented in the data. And so that's like data inclusion. But then we also need to have more of a focus on data quality. And I don't know any organization that's really, and again, I'm sure they exist, but that's super excited about the quality of their data. Like we just have the most high quality data. It's an issue everywhere. And so the same excitement that we're putting downstream on the downstream algorithms, we need to take that all the way upstream at the point of data collection and on data quality and management, so that we can have more confidence in those downstream algorithms, and kind of just takes away some of the unnecessary noise around what we're trying to address, by making sure that things upstream are in order.
I couldn't agree more. This is an area of focus in public health informatics, as well as how do we understand these determinants. And I hear I hear you as a person struggling with some of this, maybe where places where your passion may be at odds with realities of business. I think that we all have interesting jobs, and the most interesting part of the job is when it's hard to make decisions, right? And we all have hard decisions to make. I'm just curious, in your role, what are some of the hard judgment calls you have to make? Things that that it may have even taken you a little while, or you flip-flopped on. Do you have hard questions in your job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the questions, that we kind of grapple with are relative to the perception of governance and the role of governance in an enterprise or in a business. And oftentimes I think the perception is that it's just going to slow down. Like if we have to actually stop and think about the ethical implications of using a certain set of data for a certain model that's going to have a certain outcome, like that takes time, and people have to come together. Primarily, senior leaders in the organization have to come together to assert what that position is, if we're truly being thoughtful about using that type of data. And that's not something that was pervasive, at least not in the health insurance space. Maybe not necessarily in healthcare space, and maybe not in a lot of spaces, because it makes you have to pause and like think and talk. And everybody is not like that. Sometimes that can be met with some derision, because it's like, oh, that's kind of an academic exercise. But then, I have to say, well, is it, or is it the right thing to do? So you have to really, I've had to be very, I like to be very clear and direct on whatever the ask is. And, you know, because there can be a perception of, oh, this is going to take too long, or, is this really going to affect our bottom line, or is this going to be a value add? You kind of just have to stand on the principle and say, yes, it is. And we're going to try to make it as painless as possible, but it's the right thing to do. And I found myself saying that many times over the course of the journey, because everyone doesn't always catch the vision or see necessarily the value. So some of those tough choices, there's this huge, AI capability that this vendor wants to implement, and it's going to be amazing, and it's going to save us this much time. We're going to gain this much percentage of productivity, and blah blah. All of the great things. Like, yeah, that's great. That's great. But we still got to do the foundational stuff. Slow down. We're gonna do this. We're gonna, and that can be a difficult pill to swallow for some people, because they're used to just running 100 miles an hour. So a lot of my work is, I'm not gonna, like, we're not gonna make innovation. We're not gonna slow innovation down for governance, but we're also not going to not do the right thing for the sake of innovation. We have to build a culture of ethics, a culture of appropriate use of data, and really, again, humanizing the data that we're using. It has to be a cultural shift. It cannot be just a set of agnostic processes that someone has to do off the side of their desk. It has to be everyone acknowledging that this is the right thing to do. And that goes along with talking about issues with risk. Should we use this vendor? It presents this risk to the organization, or it presents this risk. We have certain risk dimensions that we evaluate. And those can be tough calls because there's someone on the business side that has said that it's gonna generate this much revenue, or it's gonna save this percentage of productivity. And you have to be, prepared to make those calls based on principle, in a way that still gets the buy-in and that maintains the collaborative relationships in the organization. Because if you're vacillating, or if you're not totally standing on the principles, but still willing to have the conversation, others are not gonna, you're not gonna, it's not gonna be convincing, and then it's gonna feel like a set of processes that just need to get done, get it over with. And so those are some of the struggles, like the day-to-day struggles, being the person that's saying no. I think the people that may have it worse than me are the privacy lawyers and legal. They probably have it worse, but we're kind of neck and neck in terms of, struggling to make some of these hard calls.
If you're doing your job, then I'm sure they have plenty to do. And I know you're doing your job. I have a question from the audience. I'm going to work that in. In the meantime, I was just going to ask, so I hear the word principles quite often, and you clearly have demonstrated passion in this area. And so there were so many questions I had about what you just said, but one of them is, you clearly have a North Star, and it must serve you to make these judgment calls. And it sounds like you're continuously making these judgment calls. Your North Star, and you're allowed to say this because we're all friends here, and this is Loyola, and we're into cura personalis, introspection, the whole person. Your North Star may be a little different than your corporate North Star. Now, I understand Highmark I grew up in the Pittsburgh area. I know Highmark very well. They do tons of great work. Are there times when your North Star is a little askew from their North Star?
I will say there are times when, I try to bring my North Star into Highmark and help hopefully influence Highmark's North Star, which I think is something that everyone, when you're looking for the right employer, you want to be values aligned. At a certain level, you look at the organization, at least I do, and say, well, what are the organization's values and what is the culture? Because you could probably pick from 3 or 4 different organizations, and you definitely want to pick the one, like I would want to pick the organization that's most closely aligned to my own values, so that I can just be myself. Because at the end of the day, I go in there, I'm pretty much like, you will be clear on my North Star in Highmark, and hopefully my North Star will help influence the organization North Star, which is what I think is actually the mission, right? We're all people in an organization, we're all people with different backgrounds, different worldviews, different ways of placing ourselves in the universe. And based on how we place ourselves in the universe, that determines our approach to solving problems, our approach to how we work together, our approach to the work that we do, and the value that we get or perceive from the work that we do. And so the little bit of influence that I could have in shaping Highmark's culture, I think that's actually the point. Now, there are some times where, when I think about I think financials is where I'm always uncomfortable and slightly annoyed. Um, but it's like a personal thing. It's like, I don't really care about the financials. I care about whether something's the right thing to do. And I'm also quite stubborn. Um, my kids and my husband will
Welcome.
reiterate that. I'm very stubborn. So I have a little bit of annoyance when we get into conversations around financials, because for me, it's just like not ever going to be the primary thing. And I realize, though, that for organizations, enterprises, businesses, sometimes that is the primary thing and everything else is secondary. I think that's a philosophical misalignment that is going to be there for probably almost every place that I would decide to go. And so I accept that as the cost of sharing whatever little I've learned along the way with the organization that I'm in and trying to add value. The cost of that is sometimes you're not going to like those financial conversations, or sometimes you're not going to like, some things, and to the extent that it's not opposed to my principles, or not, it doesn't force me to do things outside of it, which I would not do. I would leave. Then I can still, it's a necessary part of life. And so, there's always going to be that balance. There's no perfect organization. There's no perfect entity, just like there are no perfect people. And so I'm okay with the trade-offs that needs to be made. It's just making sure you find the right fit where you have to make fewer of those trade-offs or as few of those trade-offs as possible, and still be truly able to, to share that North Star, share that vision with the organization.
Well, you've certainly earned your stripes in the industry. I mean, clearly you're a deep thinker, and you've gone through many iterations of this. So I really appreciate how thoughtful you are. And about having choices of organizations, I feel that way about Loyola, that when your mission aligns with the organization's mission, then you can grow together. And I feel like that's very important, especially for people starting out in the industry. We had a great question. I'm gonna paraphrase it. It was from Rose Dunderdale, and the question is, essentially, how can entry middle management associates approach ethical and inclusive data collection? How can they elevate that to their managers who may be unaware? They're coming in with the fire in their belly. They've just come out of school. They're excited. Between them and you, there may be a whole layer of folks which are quote unquote doing it the old way. And I don't mean that derisive, because there's lots of value in doing it the old way. But they may have trouble actually growing into a role like yours if they're not set up for success.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not, just definitely want to be real about, there's certain organizations, and sometimes it depends on the organization's culture. If it's very hierarchical, and maybe an organization that's not as open to ideas. But my personal preference is that there's something to be learned from everyone, regardless of role, regardless of position. So I tend to prefer like the flatter organization model that just allows people to be open to sharing those ideas. And I think those types of models are more conducive to someone, maybe an entry level individual, kind of bringing forth those ideas to say, hey, what do we think about? And sometimes a little more tactical trick is just, if you are one of those, like, an employee who's not necessarily at senior level leadership, etc., framing it as a question and just genuinely being curious on what the response is going to be is a way to get that thought in the door, right? And because then it's like you're curious. You're saying, well, have we considered collecting X, Y, or Z data as part of like helping us build a more solid, data set for this model or whatever? Then people actually have to consider it. Like, oh, actually, no, we didn't. We never considered it, but tell me more. And then I think, so that's like a tactical thing that I would, suggest everyone do, particularly if you feel like there may be some barriers to, or some just knowledge gaps or blind spots. Then you're asking the question and your intent is to improve everyone, right? Then the next thing that I would suggest is, you know, every individual, regardless of role, has a certain mission. Like if you're sitting in a meeting, there's a reason why you're there, hopefully. And if your mission is to listen to the discussion and hopefully provide some input, then I would think that you don't leave the meeting until you fulfilled your mission in that meeting. So if you have a question about like, or you have a concern to say, well, we probably have some gaps or blind spots just from an org perspective, and here's some things we can think about, and then be willing to like do the work, or at least jumpstart it, because you're the one holding that key that could potentially open up um, other individuals' minds and say, yeah, we need to address this. Then you have to be mission minded in your work. You have to be mission minded in your meeting. And it's kind of your responsibility to fulfill your mission. So I think people shouldn't feel that their role or position prevents them from contributing and from opening up other individuals' minds. Um, you have to be rooted enough to and be willing to do that, regardless of your role. Anything else is you're kind of just limiting yourself, because of your perception of what, maybe a manager has more seniority and more experience and all that. But like, what does that have to do with a very legitimate question you're asking? It's kind of like, who cares? You have a very good question on the table. And so your mission is to ask it and hopefully get a response or something that serves as a catalyst for more.
I bet there's a couple students on the call that would love to have you as a manager. It's a great. I think it's a great way to handle those situations. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'd love to hear from the audience if possible. But of course the last one's not that easy. We've heard about the work at Highmark, and it sounds like you really have a handle on it, but it's not easy. There's ethical dilemmas, there's some angst you have in your everyday work, but we're making progress and it's promising. Are we ready to regulate AI at a federal level? Are the Onyinyechi's of the world, of the United States, are they ready to get together and do this thing?
Oh man, that is a very difficult question. And I would say we need guardrails, but I don't know that we're ready to regulate. And the reason why I don't know that we're ready to regulate is because we are not yet even on the same page. Like when we talk about even data privacy, that's still being done at a state by state level, state by state level, that now like organizations that function across multiple states now have to navigate how to address or not run afoul of the different state privacy regulations. So when you add AI into the mix, I'm not, maybe I have some biases just because of, other legislative processes, and the language is always so vague and unhelpful, and then you got to figure it out, and and I know that has a purpose, but I do think at least grounding on principles is progress, and I've seen a lot of that. So at least people are thinking in terms of like the foundational, what do we need to know? How do we need to think about this? I do think there's a lot more work to be thoughtful about how AI is regulated. And I've sat in some of the CMS calls, the AHIP calls, the Department of Health and Human Service calls, and sometimes sometimes they're not asking the right question. They're very much tactical or very siloed in thinking. And even the way they wanted to address, one of the things they were proposing was like a chief AI officer in different areas. And I'm just like, we don't need more silos. We need more integration. And so we need that expertise to be pervasive across the departments and across different areas. So I think we're still a ways away from doing it well. And I would use like privacy and how we've approached privacy regulations as an indicator of what we could potentially expect for AI. But hopefully, hopefully we're farther along. Hopefully there's like a magic pill that makes it painless.
Oh, I need that pill. I just need that pill. Yeah, I know that's not an easy question. We have about 10 minutes left. I just wanted to make sure that people on the call had a chance. If they're even if you had a comment or a question, you could put it into the chat, or you could unmute yourself. Stephen, are people able to unmute themselves now, or is everyone muted?
and that folks are muted.
You can just talk. They can hear you from my. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
And can you hear, Professor?
Nicholas, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I'm able to hear you, Steve.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's something wrong with my computer, so I have to work through so please bear with me. But I'm so sorry. And the question was,
are people able to unmute themselves, or are they all muted?
We can unmute ourselves.
Oh, okay, great. Does anyone have a question for Dr. Daniel? I still have questions if no one else has a question, so you're not going to get off that easy. Let's just give it a minute, though.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I do have another question, and if folks want to jump in, that's fine. So I asked you a lot of hard questions, and I didn't want to leave it without a hopeful. Oh, we've got the bells, the church bells in the background. How perfect. I didn't want to leave without some hope. What gives you hope in your role? What are some developments that you see that are promising, that, you know, make you feel like maybe we'll get this right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good question, because sometimes I'll admit I tend to skew towards more of the skepticism. And it can be constantly thinking about risk and potential adverse impacts. It can be a bit of a downer. But I think what makes me hopeful is the fact that there are voices at the table that are actually being thoughtful about the application of AI across, all these different industries. And I think that without those voices, we would have been barreling down the ski slope with, sharp skis down the path of all the innovative, great things that we can do and how we're going to generate this much revenue and save this much money. And I think these considerations of ethics and risk and personhood and impacted populations have really added some balance to those skis, and have kind of right-sized right-sized some of the discussion. And I've seen an amplification of voices like ours that are saying, let's be thoughtful about what we're doing, and let's not just look at, for some there's all upside, but it has to be a balanced discussion and balanced engagement. And so that gives me hope. And there are groups that are intentional about balancing that conversation and forcing the conversation around the ethical application of AI, and technology and its impacts. So
that's great. Those bells still going. So apparently they really want people to go to church today. But that's great. I hear this voices at the table from you, and I'm such a fan of it. Anyone in my lab knows this is what we talk about, is the table, actually, all the time. So really, really great to hear that. Rose has another question for us. Maybe it's the last question, Stephen. I don't know how we're doing on timing, but and I really like this one because it has to do with workforce. And this is something that I've seen in roles that I've been in before, is that, I'm just going to read the question. When we consider ethical AI, does this include hiring ethical and diverse individuals who program the models themselves? How would this relate to governance over the programs themselves?
yes. So I think that question is really a question on pipelines, which is also a reason why I have some hope. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is, you need to have the pipelines to get folks in the role that have the different perspectives that are impacted. We're all impacted to a degree, but obviously there are groups that are traditionally either underrepresented in certain fields, underrepresented in certain, research, as an example. And so you have to get those individuals into the pipeline that's going to lead to the roles and the roles that are going to be building these machine learning models and that are going to be able to govern. And so what that looks like is, again, you've got different STEM programs, STEM programs for people of color, STEM programs for underrepresented minorities, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have to create a pipeline for those that are already, in their careers to pursue a different path. And that requires encouragement for groups that may not necessarily be represented in these fields. I do think there's something to be said for individual impetus and individual determination. No one can force you into a field that you don't want to be in, but we have to at least have the environment where it's possible. And then individuals will have to decide, well, if we want to make sure that we at least have a seat at the table in determining or impacting the downstream outcomes, then we have to be aware of the pipelines, get folks that we know into those pipelines, and have that kind of career progression across the areas of AI, where there's data science, AI, machine learning, engineering, etc. So that's really the only way to do it. There's really it has to be organic. You can't force it. It does have to be organic, because the organic method is the sustainable method, whereas the forced method is kind of shallow. And so that would be my recommendation to that question.
That's great. So I really appreciate. I asked a lot of questions. You really did a lot of work in this hour, Onyinyechi. So I really appreciate that. Stephen, do you have some wrap up? Anything? Any business for the AI consortium or anything else?
Can you hear me okay, Nicholas?
We sure can.
Oh my goodness, my computer crashed for the last 20 minutes, so I apologize. Well, actually, I wanted to thank you both for a great presentation, very enlightening, and you, both of your deep experience in the health area and informatics and AI, which is massive areas for AI application, of course, has been very enlightening. So I wanted to thank you both. Yeah, just one quick announcement, and then I'll let everybody get to lunch. We'll be announcing our next distinguished lecture here in the next 3 weeks. We're also queuing up for our June 27 AI and Financial Services Industry Conference at Loyola Quinlan. And so if you'd like to be involved in the AI Business Consortium, please drop us a note. And again, Nicholas and Dr. Daniel, thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. It was fun. Really appreciate it, Nicholas and Stephen. It was great.
Yeah, my pleasure. You got a great group here, Stephen.
Yeah, I appreciate it. All right. Thank you all, and we'll be in touch for the next one.
Thanks.